All right. So before we get into talking specifically about the case study for your group work today, I want to introduce the idea of habitat fragmentation, which I'm sure is something you've heard about, but I want to define it a little bit more formally and think about some examples and better understand the ways in which this impacts wildlife populations. So we can define habitat fragmentation as the process during which a large expanse of habitat, so essentially, we're talking about a continuous large area that's transformed into smaller patches. And those smaller patches are isolated from each other by some other type of habitat that is not ideal for wildlife, and it's not the original habitat. Okay, so there's essentially a complete area of prime habitat is transformed into a matrix in which you have small patches of prime habitat separated by larger areas of non-ideal habitat. Okay. So here's a nice example of habitat fragmentation looking at Norway. Okay, this is looking specifically at what is defined as wilderness area in Norway, which in order to be defined as so has to be more than 5 kilometers from basically human development, such as roads and railways, things like that. Okay, and so you can see as we go across 100 years, and surely as this area, the population of Norway has grown and the infrastructure has grown, you have what's mostly a large continuous area of habitat, especially in the north here in 1900. And this is over time transformed into smaller fragments, okay, with the green being the wilderness, right? And so even though there's still some larger fragments in there, they are all separated by the white space, which is non-wilderness. So that would be that non-ideal habitat that separates those patches of ideal habitat. Okay, so this is generally how fragmentation works, right? You start out with something big, and over time, generally due to human development, you get this pattern of fragmentation. So I want to talk a little bit about what are the major changes that happen in terms of the quality and the quantity of the habitat and its availability to wildlife as fragmentation occurs. Okay, so I'm sorry, this is. Um, so so there's three major effects of habitat fragmentation. The first is there's reduction in the total area of habitat available to the animals. Okay, now again, we're thinking that the matrix outside of those habitat patches is not ideal, right? So we're talking about a reduction in the total area of the ideal habitat. Okay, so you can see here reduced areas noted in this first graph, and this is a figure from a paper that really tried to do a meta-analysis and understand how these different effects of fragmentation impact the biological communities living in these areas. Okay, so again, first major effect is reduced total area available in terms of the ideal habitat. And what they found, what these researchers found most strongly is that this reduction in total area has a big impact on species persistence, okay? So these reductions in total area due to fragmentation mean that some species are simply going to go locally extinct. So you're going to have loss of diversity in your ecological community as a result of habitat fragmentation. A second major effect of habitat fragmentation is that there's increased isolation, okay? Previously, you had an area that was continuous. Animals could move through it without having to navigate lower quality spaces, okay? Those lower quality spaces are generally so because of either reduced resource availability or greater risk, such as greater risk due to predation or interaction with humans, like being hit by a car. So certainly breaking up a continuous area into patches, high quality patches that are separated from each other throughout a lower quality habitat matrix is going to create increased isolation. okay? And not surprisingly, what these researchers found when they looked at the potential impacts of, what increased isolation did in terms of multiple ecological factors, they found that this strongly really impacted movement between fragments. Okay, so animals are more likely to stay in the habitat patch they're in than move between, because there is some cost either in lost time and energy, uh, or in risk, right, of not finding food or being eaten when they traverse the low quality matrix that separates these habitat patches. Finally, the third impact is that there's increased edge. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but increased edge is the area of the of a habitat patch that is in contact with the um, low quality matrix surrounding it, right? And so edge habitats are generally not the same quality as that interior habitat that's not as disturbed, right? So um, the idea with increased edge is that if you were to kind of like add up the spatial area of this like light green edge around here, right? That actually even this little change of like putting a little bump out here, this creates more edge compared to a continuous circle, right? So edge habitat is generally lower quality in terms of animal survival, um, and ability to get resources, things like that. Edge is worse than interior habitat. Okay, and this has a strong impact on community composition. Okay, what species you find. There are some species that do better in edge habitat, but most don't, right? That's kind of the exception, not the rule. And so you can get edge habitat that's sort of dominated by the few species that do really well, but you'll get species diversity loss there as well. The more edge habitat you have compared to the internal habitat. Okay, last thing I just want to mention is touching on that edge idea again. And this shows you how both size and shape of a habitat fragment impact edge. Okay, so here you can see a small habitat, a small patch could essentially be all edge, right? Whereas you move from a medium to a large patch, there's a greater area that would be considered the internal undisturbed habitat, right? So large patches are going to be better than small in terms of preserving that high quality habitat and producing less edge. Shape can also be important, right? And that a circle you can see here generates, it's a medium-sized circle, but there's some undisturbed interior habitat there. Whereas if you were to take this same space and stretch it into a rectangle, you would see there'd only be like a little strip. This is less area than this, right? It's a little strip and it's probably biologically less meaningful to a species because it's so narrow, right? So the amount of interior versus edge habitat you get can also differ based on the shape. Okay, with something long and narrow like this, less ideal for a primary habitat patch than something. Okay, this is the last thing I wanted to say is so this point I want to talk about is how does fragmentation affect different species? And you're going to discuss some of this in your group work. But I want you to imagine a situation where you have this habitat mosaic, right? Where you have the black squares are habitat fragments, okay? So they're high quality habitat. And the white squares are that low quality habitat in between that's not valuable to animals, right? To understand how different species are impacted by this, you have to think about their home range size. And by home range, I mean the space an animal needs to meet its daily needs, okay? To get food, water, find mates, okay? Find cover, all these things like that. That's the area where it spends all its time. Now, take something like the grain-eating mouse species. Well, they have a pretty small home range, and so they might not actually be that impacted by habitat fragmentation, as long as they can find, a home range within one of the habitat patches, right? And they can live their whole life just in that patch because they can meet all their needs within that patch. Now think about a species like a carnivorous hawk. Okay? This species has a much, much larger home range. And so they are going to be much more affected by habitat fragmentation. Okay, because now if you think about what this habitat originally looked like before fragmentation, let's say it was all black, this species has lost half of the viable habitat in which to meet its needs um, if this is its home range, right? So it might have to greatly increase the size of its home range to meet its needs, or it may just not get enough food or resources, okay? So home range and the size of home ranges and the scale of habitat fragmentation are important pieces to understanding um, how fragmentation impacts a species. Okay, and so a habitat is a primary way to, as managers, to combat habitat fragmentation is try to link them using corridors. Okay, so the idea being that if there are major habitat, patches, especially ones that have good edge to interior ratios, they're larger. If you can connect those with corridors that allow animals to move through them in a high quality corridor habitat, this should fix some of these problems specifically related to isolation between patches. So you'll be exploring the potential for using corridors in the rest of this